The Wyanoke, and that's how you pronounce it, not Weyanoke. The Wyanoke people were folks who lived on the middle reach of the James River. They had their own chief, but they were subject to a greater chief, a paramount chief, that most people have heard of in this world because he had a famous daughter. The man was Powhatan and the daughter was Pocahontas. So the Wyanokes were officially the subjects of Pocahontas' daddy, who ruled all of eastern Virginia from Richmond, Fredericksburg, Washington, eastward down those rivers. 400 years ago, eastern Virginia looked somewhat different than it does now, and looked quite different from anything that Europeans or urban Americans today were accustomed to. For one thing, it is a world of water and land interspersed, interlaced, if you like. The Indians lived in their canoes. Not nearly as much land had been cleared for farming. The Indians were farmers, but there weren't as many Indians. So the place looked like a wilderness to the English who arrived, and if we had a time machine, it would look pretty much like a wilderness to us.
Here the rivers flow down from the white sands and through the plains and into the bay. Never have heaven and earth come together to form a more perfect place for habitation. Here, a man with his freedom and good wit and hard work may make a fortune quickly.
The Europeans, and we still today, tend to see water as a barrier. It's a boundary. Counties and cities often have rivers and creeks as their edges, as their boundaries. In the Indian world, it was the reverse. Creeks and rivers were the center of territories. These were people who did most of their traveling by canoe, and canoes being like our minivans, you carry everything heavy in your canoe, you take it down the roadway, which is actually a waterway. When a river was really, really broad, like the Potomac at its mouth, then you would have separate tribes living on each side, though they were often friends. But when you got to a narrower part of the river, such as the Potomac up around Fairfax County, and also the James River where the Wyanokes lived, there the river was narrow enough and the paddling across was short enough that they simply considered both sides to be their territory. And we see records about 2 Wyanoke towns on Captain John Smith's map. And that's because it was the same people. It was basically the same town. The Wyanokes made their living partially by hunting and fishing and partially by farming. They were not nomads at all. They lived in towns, and right in amongst the houses were gardens in which they raised corn, beans, and squash. Europeans were not used to our corn at all and found it rather interesting and soon began buying it. The people who raised the corn shocked the Europeans because it was the women. Women were the farmers. It was the men who did the hunting and most of the fishing. But the farmland was controlled by the women. The women also built the houses, and they wanted a shorter commute to work each day, so they built the houses right close to the gardens. The location of towns then was decided upon by the women, because the women did the work in the town. The men were out. They wouldn't have had much say about where the town went. But the center of everything was the water, because everybody was in and out of the water. Water was also a major source of their food, with fish and shellfish of various kinds. So they were constantly going to the water just to get part of that night's supper. Water was central. They had to have waterfront towns. And for that reason, you find the maps showing Indian towns only along the rivers and some of the creeks. You don't find Indian towns way back away from the river. That was hunting territory. It was public hunting land. So you're not going to find Indian towns back there. The Wyanoke Indians only appear for a few decades. in the records in Virginia. This didn't mean that they got massacred by anybody. They didn't. It doesn't mean that they died out. They didn't. It means that they moved. They continued living on their James River land on both sides of the James River. Beautiful farmland there, by the way, some of the best in the state. The Indians knew how to find good farmland, but they had to move away from it. After the war with the English of 1644 to 46, the pressure the English could put on them by that time drove them away from James River, and they went clear down into northeastern North Carolina and settled briefly in a number of places, always on a creek bank, always in places that were claimed by somebody else. And eventually they simply gave the thing up and they merged with another tribe. The people they merged with were the Nottaways. When the Nottaways and the Wyanoks and some Nansomans took English names, which happened after 1700, then you have some of the Wyanoke descendants taking the name Wyanoke. Wyanoke. And eventually that name died out, but the people would have had descendants. Eventually the Nottaways dispersed altogether, and there are Nottaway descendants all over the United States, and some of them have got some Wyanoke ancestry.
My name is Mike Barber with the Department of Historic Resources. I'm the state archaeologist. We're here in Richmond in the Virginia Artifact Collection Room, where we have artifacts which are used for educational purposes. In the back, we have another 6.5 million artifacts. Right now, we're going to look at some sewing tools that are like those that may have been used at the Wyanoke village site. Here's probably a typical earlier arrow point. And once you got to almost to the contact period, you started seeing these arrow points that were like this. So progressively gotten smaller. And in fact, as they reduced in size, they were more effective because they had a better penetrating ability. I have an example here of a tool that was used for digging, basically a hoe. Originally, archaeologists thought that it was hafted like this and was used as an axe. But you can see from the wear patterns on these things that most of them were hafted like this, if this is the handle, and they were used in digging. And you can see the wear pattern along the edge, where this edge is smooth from the friction of digging in the ground, and this edge is not. So again, a hoe-like motion to dig up roots and things of that sort. Now this is the drawer that holds a lot of the bone tools. This is my favorite kind of stuff. This is a very common tool during the late woodland times, and this is the lower leg bone of a white-tailed deer. Probably don't know it, but deer have basically two knees. This particular bone is in your ankle. In fact, it's two bones in your ankle. White-tailed deer, it's sort of the lower leg bone that articulates with the hoof. But in any case, what they've done is they've taken this, they've hollowed it out, and you can see the lines where they hollowed it out, and then they use it as a draw knife to process deer hides and other hides as well. Pretty interesting tool. Some sites, we find hundreds of these. And to me, it indicates that not only are they processing a whole lot of deer hides, but they're probably engaged in trading these deer hides for other commodities because they're producing so many. This is something you find on a lot of sites, and it's a eastern box turtle, and it's been hollowed out and made into a cup. The three highest collected animals on most sites is first the white-tailed deer, then the turkey, and the third animal is the box turtle. This is another type of artifact we find on prehistoric sites that I find fascinating, the use of the Virginia Indians of tobacco. During prehistoric times with Native Americans, it was something that was used only during certain ceremonies or religious activities. Here's a typical early late woodland pipe that made of clay, fired clay. Another example. can see the bowls are quite small, so there's not a whole lot of tobacco being smoked, but again for religious or ceremonial reasons. As time went on and we hit the colonial period, something happened that was quite interesting, and you get pipes that are decorated like this. You can see the starburst pattern, which is quite unique. And this was something that happened during colonial times. The decorations are obviously made with colonial tools, but we're not sure exactly who the makers were. Some of these motifs go back into prehistoric times. Let's take a look at the artifacts we have in this cabinet. These things are some of the most interesting artifacts I've seen in a long time. Well, this particular artifact is a Kirk stemmed point. Any point you find in Virginia that's not a triangular point was most likely a spear point. So this is a spear point. It's of interest in that when you haft it onto the shaft for the spear, that's what stuck out. So this is one that was probably near its end of its lifespan, approaching exhaustion, and they probably threw it away. Here's another one that's a little later in time. Again, hard to believe, but this is a spear point, probably used with an atlatl. We'll talk about atlatls in a little while. But you can see when you haft this point, that's what would stick out. So you can see that would be very ineffective. Originally the point was probably this long, but through exhaustion and reef sharpening through time, this is what you have left. So ineffective, get rid of it. These are sort of middle woodland points, in the 6,000 to 4,000 year BC range. And by the time you get to the Wyanoke village time period, you're dealing with points that look like this, triangular points. These are arrow points. The bow and arrow was probably invented somewhere around maybe 1000 BC, but as time went on, they started using these smaller and smaller and smaller triangular points. And that's what we see here. This is one of the made of quartz, probably typical of that area. This is one example that I was looking for. This is again one of those large broad spears during the late Archaic time period. This is about 2500 to 1000 BC. But you can see the difference in the edges here. This edge is fairly straight, where this one is curved. This one is curved from use and resharpening. And in fact, this was hafted and used as a cutting tool, as a knife. And you can see the wear along this edge. And that's typical of these types of points. Perhaps they were used as spear points, but in essence, a lot of those, you can see the wear pattern where they were converted into knives. Now this is the drawer that holds a lot of the bone tools. This is the kind of stuff that really fascinates me. I guess it's the concept of bones, and then taking those bones and make them into something functional. You may not be aware of it, this is a tarso-metatarsal from a turkey, a lower leg bone from a turkey. And these were very, very good bones to make very, very sharp awls. You can see the point here. And these things were used for poking holes, driving holes into deer hides and things of that sort. These are some of the most easily made tools. This is the ulna, one of the arm bones or front leg bones from white-tailed deer. And basically it's shaped in this manner naturally, and all they do is sharpen the end. And again, you can see the sharpness. You can see where the use is. It's actually tapered at the end to this very sharp point. And this one not so much, but you can see again it's tapered from use. This is a deer antler, and you can see it's been hollowed out. And this was probably made into a headdress and probably used by the shaman or the religious practitioner in ceremonial activities. Another product that we're making in fair numbers were bone fish hooks. And there were two techniques they used primarily. One was from the ulna, and another one was from the deer toe bones themselves. They would cut those in half and make them into fish hooks. Occasionally you find things of this sort. although this was probably not a tool. This is a part of a bear skull, and this is the one of the canines. A lot of times you'll see these canines perforated for suspension, and they would wear them as gorgets or things of that sort. This is some of the most interesting types of artifacts we have here at the Department of Historic Resources. These have been recovered since the 19th century. Folks wondered what on earth they were. They're very highly polished. They're pretty ornate, certainly decorative, and they were confused archaeologists for many, many years. And what archaeologists finally decided that these things were obviously high status items, and in fact early on they called them banner stones. And what they thought was that the chief would have a staff, and on this staff he'd have some of these stones which would demonstrate his high status within the village itself. Did further research on several sites. You can see the variety here is just amazing, but research on several sites, particularly sites that they had a lot of these found in Kentucky, and the question was finally answered not only by looking at artifacts, but also examining other cultures around the world. And I don't know if you guys realize it, but archaeology is not an independent study in itself. Archaeology is a subdiscipline of anthropology. Anthropology is the study of all cultures, all people, at all times, everywhere. Archaeology is the study of extinct cultures, cultures that no longer exist. But in order to get a better understanding of these cultures, we can look at cultures that are at the same level of social organization, and then use some of the analogies from those cultures to determine how artifacts like these were used. Let me show you a reconstruction of how these things were used. So, you've seen those artifacts. Now we have to figure out what they are, right? And that's part of archaeology. It's the mystery of trying to figure out what these things were used for. And so we looked at the other cultures that were still in existence and artifacts that they used. And perhaps you'll recognize this, very similar to what we were seeing in the drawer. And this indeed is what we call and figured out was an atlatl weight. And this is an atlatl which throws this spear. Atlatl is a term that was borrowed from South America, from Mesoamerica, where they still use these things during contact period. And in essence, what we have here is a spear thrower. Now, before this, a spear could be thrown by hand. And I'm sure the Native Americans were very accurate with that. But with the atlatl, with the spear thrower, it works as a simple machine, lever action. And when you throw this, it doesn't leave your hand at the same level. What happens is it extends upward. And as you can thrust it, it adds distance and accuracy. And so this thing flies off and hopefully fits the prey. The atlatl weight was an invention that helped not only with the distance by providing more weight to the throw, but it also helped to balance the spear itself. So this is quite an invention. This is something that we don't use a whole lot today. So in order to figure it out, archaeologists had to not only look at the archaeological record, but they had to look at the ethnographic record as well. One of the mysteries was, how did they get the hole in the atlatl weight? Obviously, with a hole, they can more adequately tie the atlatl into place. The hole itself was drilled. It was probably drilled using an abrasive like sand and a stone tool and many, many hours of work. These polished stone tools, such as the atlatl, are not easily made. And I'm sure that the person, the hunter that was using these things, was quite proud of the weight and probably the atlatl itself. Also, you can see the relationship with these things with the detachable tip. which is another interesting invention. So instead of having to carry 10 spears, what they would carry in their quiver was 10 of these. And they'd throw the Atlatl spear, they basically hit the quarry. If they didn't, they'd retrieve the spear itself, and then they'd rehaft it with another spear point. So it's, it's efficiency, accuracy, efficiency, and an amazing tool that probably was used in Virginia for upwards to 6,000 to 8,000 years. So very, very interesting tool. The contact with the Powhatan obviously is something that John Smith talked about it in a lot of ways. We've been dealing with the Werowocomoco site, which is in Gloucester County, and it is interesting in many ways, but mostly because we have evidence of the early trade. Primarily, we find on that particular site, the trade goods are copper. And it's interesting, early on, John Smith was trading copper for corn because the Jamestown settlement folks were starving, so they wanted the corn. And then what happened was, early on, you get 50 bushels of corn for a kettle. And then Powhatan figured it out and demanded more and more and more copper. And eventually, the market was flooded. The value of the copper deteriorated greatly. Originally, and you can understand how this happened before contact with Europeans, the copper came from the Great Lakes. And it didn't come in large quantities, it came in small quantities, and it was reserved for the chiefs. The chiefs would make pendants out of the copper, and this would denote their status. Copper pendant, big deal. And then, of course, when the kettles came in and the Indians started chopping those up, there was so much copper that it was, it became something, a known commodity that, everyday folks could get a hold of. So it deteriorated that as a status symbol, certainly. Other things that were traded, the glass beads came into play and were very important. Powhatan preferred the white beads because they mirrored the shell beads that they were used to. But in other areas, they traded beads that were of many different colors and many different layers. And this went from trade for corn into trade for deer skins and other commodities as well, a little bit later.
Obviously, the Wyanoke and the Englishmen who arrived in Virginia did not speak the same language. So the English began sending some of their younger colonists, boys of 13 and 14, who were still young enough to learn languages easily, send them to live among the Indians to try to learn the Powhatan language, which was spoken by the Wyanokes. The Wyanokes also wanted some of their young people to begin speaking English, but we don't have a record of whether any Indian kids went to live with the English for that purpose. But having interpreters, and preferably more interpreters than the other side, actually turned into a game. It turned into a competition. Before there were good interpreters, which means for the first 2 years of the Jamestown colony, people had to communicate between the two sets of folks by body English and facial expressions, old rubber face. That was the only way that they could communicate with one another. And obviously then there were going to be misunderstandings. It meant that the early years of the Jamestown colony were a very rocky road for both sides. And each side wound up offending the other without meaning to. That's what happens if you don't speak somebody's language. One kind of misunderstanding that the English and the Wyanokes had early on, and it continued to be a misunderstanding for many years, was that the English wanted to buy corn when their own supplies ran out, and they assumed that men were the heads of Indian households, and so they would try to get the men to sell corn. It may not have been up to the men in Indian culture. Women raised the corn, and they were perfectly capable of selling it. And the English may well have offended those Indian women by refusing to talk to them and going to the husbands instead. The English and the Indian men had their difficulties, because they were all very interested in arms for warfare. Most of the English colonists had been to the wars in Europe, and they had firearms. The Indian men lived in a place where raiding went on all the time. The enemies for the Wyanoks were on the west side of Richmond. Warfare came right to your door. So the Indian men with their bows and arrows and tomahawks were expert in using them. They were expert marksmen. But they soon realized that the English weapons, initially sounding scary, those weapons could shoot farther. The bigger weapons anyway. And since these were all military men of one sort or another, they were fascinated with each other's weapons. And of course the English assumed that their weapons were better, which was not necessarily true. And the Indians were dying to see them close up and handle them and try them out. And the English wouldn't allow it. And that caused offense. The irony is that for the wilderness over here, almost complete wilderness outside the Indian towns, Indian weapons were actually better because you could fire them moving fast, taking cover, firing again, take more cover, fire again. The English weapons were all muzzle loading things, and many of them were very, very heavy. Some of them had to be put up on a tripod. You couldn't hold them up yourself. And those were meant for open field fighting. Well, where do you find open fields in this part of the world? So the English weapons were good for scaring people, but they weren't that good in actual fights. About 1650 to 1701. That was the period in which the Virginia Indians lost most of their land to encroaching settlers, because the settlers were pouring in droves, and they were terrifically land hungry. They were hoping to raise tobacco and make their fortune. The greed was incredible, and the Indians had the misfortune of not understanding that once you sold land to an English person, that English person considered it to be English property for the rest of time. And Indian culture didn't practice it that way. If you farmed a piece of land, it was yours as long as you farmed it, and whenever you let it go fallow, it becomes public land again. It's not yours. You have to share. And through sales like this, and sometimes simply through being run out, the people lost most of their land. Oh, and come to think of it, you may like beef. Well, the critter that makes the beef, the cow, was a major player in Indians losing their land. Cows, if you have ever stood next to one, are big things. They're heavy, they're thick. They may like to step on your feet. And if somebody's cows come onto your land, you probably are going to have a miserable time trying to get them off again. Cows also have been known to eat corn, and they come into an Indian person's cornfield and they start munching away, and you're not big enough to drive them away. So herding your cattle onto an Indian's cornfield was a real good way to get that Indian family to lose their sustenance and have to go off and get food somewhere else. If it's toward the end of the growing season, you're not going to raise any more corn. They've got to get the stuff for their bread from various marsh plants like tuckahoe. And so, of course, they're going to leave the vicinity. Englishman then moves in, considers the land his, maybe gets a patent on it, which makes it legal, and the land is lost to Indian ownership thereafter.